to introduce Tony Praza. Tony has been, doesn't need any introduction. He's been a strong supporter here in PLATO. He's a strong also member of Citizens Climate Lobby and is very dedicated to helping the planet. Tony is not a nuclear engineer or a radiobiologist, and so he's come at this from the point of view of a layman. And I'm delighted today to listen to Tony give his perspective on a person who is knowledgeable, interested in business, tries to look on the positive side of business's interest in climate change, and it should be interesting to see his perspective on his reactions to nuclear medicine, to nuclear energy, as he has followed the field. So, Tony, turn the hosting over to you, and I look forward very much to your talk and the discussion that follows.
Very good. Thank you, Richard. Appreciate it. Well, first off, good morning, everybody. And although Richard indicated I don't need any as far as introduction, I do want to touch a little bit on my background to give you a perspective. Over the years, I've been primarily involved with information systems and technology dating back to 1968 when I took my first programming language as I was working at a manufacturing company in Chicago. So I in that particular position, starting out as a programmer, systems analyst, and then moving into management in 1973. And I've been involved with management ever since then. Playing the pros and cons of the economics of how industry, whatever industry it might be, looks at the economics and relationship to every return on investment. More often than not, the emphasis towards the social issues are put to the side, and the bottom line and growth are things that industry is most interested in. I've had the benefit and exposure to be involved with over 10 nonprofit, socially organized organizations like the United Way. Most of you know of the United Way, both as a community leader and also as a board on the United Way in a small community many years ago. But that got me involved with a lot of other areas. So in addition to those other areas, I also was a member of the utility industry group, because the company I was with from 1990 to 2000, we sold products into those industries. Those particular products are meter reading technology, basically. The company's name is Itron, a very large organization, a couple $2 billion worldwide. We were using video conferencing back in 1992, but each particular connection that we're looking at right now, instead of being almost for free, back then those connections cost over $50,000 to install, and then the use was very heavy. The reason for mentioning it is it saved us a lot of money. And working with the utility industry, I definitely understood the pros and cons of deregulating utility industry and what was happening in California. And more often than not, the challenges they had in trying to see how they could grow and be prosperous and still provide energy for their customers present many challenges, and deregulation caused additional challenges. Now, the only touch on one other thing many people know of Enron. Enron was a organization that went into the gas industry and was very successful, but when they tried to get into the electric industry and control it, they ran into serious problems, both financially and culturally, and they went out of business. And a couple of people went to jail because of it. I saw that on the sideline. So main reason for touching on it, a good part of the presentation talks about the practicality of what is possible with each of the alternative methods that we're looking at for clean energy going forward. So, unfortunately, we did try before this presentation to actually allow you to hear some of the videos and audios that I have clips of. And a couple of them are quite good. So when I send this PowerPoint out, I'll pass it on through Richard as a PDF. you'll be able to actually click on the various links and actually see the various items that I'll be talking to, along with hearing. And what I find right now is that the technology has got ahead of me, and as I click to play something, I'm able to hear it, but unfortunately, you out there in Zoom land are not able to hear it. So, but I will strive to take you through it as effectively as I can. So,
Thank you, Tony. That's great. I will be happy to send that along.
okay. So factors regarding why we need more electricity is what I'm going to touch on first. There's various reasons. I just want to make sure you can see that slide that I'm showing right now, or
Loud and
it says
clear.
overview
Yep.
of today's presentation.
Yes, it's clear.
Very good. Types of generation and energy sources required to transition from a fossil fuel industry to a clean energy industry. I'll talk about both problems and opportunities. And then do we really need more nuclear power? And I'll definitely wrap it up at the end with the expectation that as we go through this, anybody feel free to ask questions. Definitely feel free to raise your hand if you'd like. Richard, if you would help me, if anybody gets into a text message, and if that happens to pop up, if you could ask that question, I sure would appreciate it.
Will do.
So one of the key elements that I'll touch on over the next couple of slides is population growth with a growing need for more energy by more people. As you'll see, and as you probably know, the world continues to grow, and there's a foundation associated with it that we need to grow with electricity and not using fossil fuels in our car and other ways of generating electricity through fossil fuels. This presentation actually is on the website. So I don't think you're able to hear that. Is that correct? You can't hear the actual audio?
Correct.
Yeah. So it continues on and talks about electricity being the fundamental requirement that is necessary . So does the text now start appearing as far as
It
closed
is
caption?
very helpful. Yes, I can see the closed captioning. Very nice, Tony. Quite clear what you want to say.
So it takes you through about 2 minutes. It's really an ad, and it's Hitachi Energy Systems, and it talks about primarily clean energy and how I should say green energy and how it will get us there. I'm not a firm believer in that, as you'll see at the end of this presentation. I do think we need the broader perspective of clean energy, which includes, of course, nuclear and some other approaches. So UN just came out with its recap associated with the COP 27 that was held over in Egypt, I believe it was.
Yes.
And this is a recap of it, and I'm not going to read it, but the basic indication is that we're not quite getting there. The article that I read recently in the New York Times by David Wells, rather. He's an opinion writer, a very strong opinion writer, I'd say. he basically says that although we took a bold step to some extent for social justice to help the countries around the world that are developing, that are being more impacted by climate change, we've at least moving forward to help them out to some extent. What we didn't do is do an effective job of closing down fossil fuels. And what you see there, the US requested in the document to say that we're not just phasing down fossil fuels, but we're actually phasing out of fossil fuels. That's what we should be doing. Unfortunately, because you have to get everybody to basically agree in consensus or a strong consensus, Saudi Arabia and Russia and other countries were very adamantly against making that statement at this point in time.
Could I interject a quick question here?
Oh, yes, definitely.
I'm not sure how realistic it is to phase out the use of all fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are used as a starting material in quite a number of important things. And we do want to get rid of plastics, but we obviously can't get rid of all plastic. And we use, just to make a CD disc, we use things that are not always synthetic, and sometimes we need some fossil fuels. So I think we should be able to say phase down. We could take it down 99%, but to phase it out entirely might be unrealistic.
Yeah, I think the primary emphasis maybe behind the scenes is in order to generate electricity, we should be phasing out the use of fossil fuels within that generation.
I'll buy that. Okay.
Now, the uses, some of the other uses and how we approach that, and how we use carbon capture and various other things. I'll touch on some of that as we go through the process. But yes, there is a need to use carbon fossil fuels in some methods, but in a more holistic approach towards how is it impacting us.
Okay.
So this is the excuse me, chart that's been shown. It's updated through 2022, and unfortunately we've passed over 4,200 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this particular chart is an indication of if we want to maintain 1.5 degrees or less of increase to global warming temperatures, then what we have to do is cut back drastically associated with the carbon that we're putting up in the air in such a way that not only do we cut back, we need to actually draw it down and start pulling that carbon out of the air so that it doesn't have long-term impact, of which it will continue to have some long-term impact, unfortunately. And this chart clearly indicates what's happened in the past and is continuing to happen. What you see over here, if you can see my little hand of,
yes,
yeah, the indication that we had a significant drop, that was COVID. Everything shut down. Definitely in the United States and in many countries around the world. And that major impact during that period of time, fossil fuel usage dropped off significantly during that period of time. And of course, it unfortunately has spiked right back up as things start picking back up.
right.
Scientists having a difficult time of understanding why, moving on to methane at this point in time, why is methane growing not exponentially, but growing significantly around the world? They don't have a good method of tracking that at this point in time and determining where it's happening. But what was agreed to, again, at COP 27 here just recently by the UN committee, is that we will invest in a methodology that will be able to track it better in the future. This one here, I'll also take you through a little bit, about 2 minutes of it, and hopefully a closed captioning will come on. And I apologize, several of these things, if I click on them, you get about a 10-second ad sometimes. In this case, it's PBS, so it's not a bad ad. So the globally, it's got a real strong short-term impact as far as methane, and it'll touch on it here, about 80 times greater than the CO2 that's put up. But unfortunately, even as you're off-gassing CO2 and capturing it, you're putting additional CO2 into the air if you burn the methane as it's being released. This will show you that it's not all being burnt, unfortunately.
And if I might add, Tony, it has a shorter half-life than CO2, but as it degrades, it oxidizes to CO2, which is much longer lasting. So you get a double whammy from methane. You get the initial greenhouse gas effect, and then you get the greenhouse gas effect of its oxidized product, CO2.
Yeah, good point. So as it says there, it indicates that the methane that's being released when they put up this new satellite system, it will be able to track it anywhere in the world, that release of methane that's occurring. So they'll have a better indication of where it's occurring in the future.
Have you seen some slides from George Erickson? He has some slides on his unintended consequences website that he keeps passing around. And it's pretty shocking to see where the methane's coming from, especially after fracking. It's just coming out of everywhere.
Yeah, this goes into that, and it'll show you where that's happening.
Yeah. Miles O'Brien is a great science correspondent.
Yes, he is. So as he stressed here, it's 86,000 square miles of area that is being used to capture oil and gas and off gas, unfortunately, methane. Its primary driving is to explore and to develop and continue to use oil. So of course, methane that goes up, the impact is not just local, it's around the world that's being impacted by the global warming that's being created by this methane off-gassing. So the only way they're able to track this methane off-gassing is with a camera like this, $100,000 camera going out to the site and actually looking at it. The satellite imagery that they'll have in the future will be able to track it anywhere in the world as far as its release. So the methane being released, not captured, unfortunately, even though they're flaring, it can't capture enough of it. And so a lot of it continues to be released. So that's what's happening in relationship to CO2 and methane, the two primary causes of global warming. The reason that it's happening, of course, is part of it, at least, is population growth. The need for more energy, for more people to have it. This is touching on the impact across the world in relationship to how CO2 is generated and where it becomes more of a factor, and how do we transition off of fossil fuels in the future. Yet, as we try to transition off, we're creating more and more things, and a lot of it is timing. Right now, unfortunately, our EVs here in Wisconsin, they use coal at the plants that, at many of the plants, excuse me, at several of the plants here in Wisconsin to generate that electricity that goes into our car. That's not a good thing. I personally don't have solar panels, but I buy green energy. I pay a premium, in theory, to Align Energy to go out and put in more solar panels and or wind turbines somewhere to get their electricity through clean power. And it's timing, right? They need more and more electricity now. At the same time, we're trying to transition off of those coal-fired plants. And of course, green energy is not necessarily clean energy. It's how you deploy it, how you do it effectively. Each of the sources have their own issues and problems associated with either creating them at the onset, as far as putting that plant up, or those solar panels or wind panels, and then maintaining them. Definitely nuclear power, which I'll touch on also later on, is probably the best cost-effective long-term approach, but it's got many obstacles to get there, fortunately. So if you've probably heard here recently, we've exceeded $8 billion, 8 billion people in the world. And unfortunately, it continues to grow. In just the last 12 years, we added 1 billion. And I looked at a few charts. I was born a few years ago, 1943. In 1943, there was just over 2 billion people in the world. Now, over approximately 80 years, okay, we've gone from 2 billion on up to, unfortunately, 8 billion, and we continue to grow. This is a caption of per capita, a chart that shows, I think, fairly nicely, an indication of who's generating the most carbon, but also how many people within that country. So it's based on population, it's based on population, it's based on the amount of CO2 and methane that's being generated.
Too bad Canada is worse than we are.
Yeah.
I guess they can always say they've got a colder climate.
Yeah, that is part of it. It's also what they're generating up there as far as the tar sands.
Yes.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Terrible. but worse is the Middle East, apparently.
Yeah, the same thing. A few people generating oil and generating lots of CO2 in the process of generating that oil. What this touches on is China and India. China's the most populous country right now in the world. India will surpass it. But if you look at the chart, oops, when you actually get the PDF, you'll be able to do a better job of zooming in on it. It actually shows you that India is like 1.4.
It's down at the bottom, 1.7, it says on your thing.
1.7, thank you. On my screen right now, there's something blocking it. I don't quite see that.
Can I point out something to you
Sure.
in the group? If you look right to blue Turkey there at 4.4, you'll find France per person is 4.3. And the reason I draw out France, of course, I am a bit of a Francophile, but beyond that, I want to compare it with Germany, which is got a value of almost double. And if you find Germany as a golden thing right near Asia, and just to the left, 4 bars over from China, and it's 8.4. So very nearly double France. These are adjacent countries. France has chosen to use nuclear energy for 75% or so of its grid, whereas Germany is shutting down its last nuclear plant in the near future, only keeping 1 or 2 open, perhaps because of the gas problem from Russia. But they've really worked hard at solar and wind, and this shows the contrast between 2 adjacent countries, powerhouses of Europe, and the success of nuclear energy in France versus the absence of nuclear energy in failing Germany. I think this graph shows it very, very well. And you showed it very nicely for me, Tony, so thanks.
So how much electricity will we need? There's various projections, and in my own personal opinion, from what I've seen, the need to have that we need more green, clean energy to support us in the future. There's significant challenges to get there, to say the least, in the time necessary. Right now, this particular projection, of which I think it indicated 2.2, yeah, it actually says that between 2020 and 2050, demand is expected to grow 2.2% per year, which kind of surprises me, since between 1975 and 2005, a 30-year period, we grew at 2.6 amount of electricity that was needed. And this is just in the US. Now, there's not a lot more people got air conditioners, a lot more people got TVs, other devices. But where we're moving as far as the future, I have to believe that it's even going to be a greater requirement. And each time I see a different chart coming out on this particular estimate for the future, it keeps on growing as far as what they need as far as the future is concerned.
Tony, I don't know if you hear me, but
yes, I definitely do.
This is Lou. Might be they're factoring in efficiency improvements. I'm not sure how you really do that, how they do that to get down to 2.2, but might be efficiency issues and I don't know, maybe something else.
Put that perspective. The United States per capita is more efficient than it was 10 years ago. We're definitely using per capita less than we did 10 years ago because of efficiency gains. China is using less per capita than it was a couple of years ago, surprisingly. But they've got a real strong focus, as I'll touch on here, on using clean energy across their country. Several things coming that I'll touch on at this point in time, one of which this particular bus that you see here is expected to be driven on hydrogen, and they're in the process of developing a ability to power those buses with hydrogen in California. And to generate hydrogen, you need electricity. At least that's the most efficient method of getting it right now, and it's not very efficient yet. There are things in the works that might make it more efficient, but more electricity will be needed to get that hydrogen. Here's a locomotive also in California. It's actually driven by batteries. The batteries that are driving that particular freight engine, of which it's actually has freight cars. It's a standard freight card. I didn't hear actual numbers. I'd have to believe, like, let's say 80 cars or more that it's pulling. It's been running for well over a year, and it's using batteries that General Motors puts into their Hummers. The only thing it needs 48 Hummer batteries to drive that freight train. Now, that freight train is very efficient. It's the most efficient way to get goods across the country in comparison to air, which is not efficient at all, or trucks, or however you might get it besides that. The most efficient is by train, rail. And this is an approach that appears to be somewhat practical. It may not be the ultimate solution. I think they're looking at renewed biodiesel at some point in time in the future. They're also looking at hydrogen potentially to drive those trains instead of diesel fuel. The interesting thing is that train, I think all freight trains right now that are being built, and most, if not all, that are in use, is actually run on electricity.
Tony, excuse me, is that train completely electric, or is it electric batteries with diesel backup?
So the electric battery is driving that particular vehicle, and it does not have diesel backup.
Okay, that's really something, because to get that much. And you said there were 80 cars on that?
It's a standard freight train, is what I've been told. I don't know what that exact number of cars are, but it's not. They're not just running the engine; they're running a freight train, and they've been running it for a year on batteries.
That's pretty impressive.
They definitely regenerate electricity as they go downhill, so that the batteries get additional life. The video, if you were to click on it, it talks about that. As far as its ability to get that.
That's great. Thank you.
Yep. Let's see. The interesting thing is that to convert it, there's a bit of a challenge to convert it, but not that much, because right now the diesel engine is driving a boiler that is actually, that engine runs on electricity, even diesel. That's standard across the country right now. This is a group in Singapore that has developed a method through electrolysis to create hydrogen, and they realized that it's more effective. Going back 3 years ago, when one night someone turned the lights off that they normally kept on, and there's significantly less hydrogen the following morning in their experimentation. So over the last 3 years, they have been refining this, and they just finally published the paper that indicates that it can generate hydrogen much more efficiently, but they still need electricity, of course. So it's promising. And the key element was light, and natural light appears to do a good job of helping it. Time of day use is something I've tracked over the years at utilities, and that presents many challenges as far as utilities are concerned, to make sure they have the right amount of power at the right time of the day. If you look at the ability to reduce your energy use costs, you can go to Line Energy or Madison Gas and Electric and ask them to change you over to time of use. And if you're willing to move most of your usage, like charging your car to the evening when you would plug it in, and most of the cars that are coming out with EVs allow you to program when you use electricity or the actual charger. gives you the capability of when you use electricity, you can reduce your rate. Well, as more and more people start using that reduced rate, the power needed at night to charge all the electric vehicles as we go forward is going to be a higher requirement again on the energy structure. So the likelihood is that we may need more electricity at night than we do and ever did before. Years ago, the higher usage was always manufacturing during the day. And that particular amount has now changed, that more usage actually occurs in the early evening as people come home and start either changing the air conditioning, turning on the lights, and various other things of that nature. Solar panels do present challenges. They don't have a long life like nuclear power plants do. They are resilient to some extent if built properly. This is 12 miles from where a hurricane Irene came through. But if it had directly on that, it would have created some serious problems, that location. So they're looking for the best place to put solar panels. This particular one looks like an attractive one. In California, they have a pilot project where they're putting solar panels across their water channels that gets water into the various cities and states from the Colorado River and whatever, or the ice flows, wherever they're getting it from. This is an approach that looks promising.
Tony, could I ask a question there?
Sure.
George Erickson has been critical of solar panels heating the air around it in the desert. In this case, by putting them over canals, I would think that the dissipation of heat by the water flowing underneath would get rid of that problem. What do you think?
Yeah, so in this case here, it's going to shelter that, so less sunlight will be hitting the water, which would create more vapor. The solar panels, I think, will act as a little bit of a shade for the water.
Okay, I was thinking that they generate some heat off the bottom, so they might just cancel each other out.
Might cancel, yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
I suppose so.
Yeah.
Thanks for the tip. Okay.
Yep. So a term water batteries is something that's used fairly frequently now, and it's something we touched on many years ago at one of the presentations that I think Richard and I were doing a joint presentation on. So you take water and that's moved through a dam, and after moving through the dam, you pump it back up. And in the process of pumping it back up, you allow it to come through again, and you keep on utilizing that. The idea is that when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, you take that and move it up. One of the one of the ones that I've researched here also talked about nuclear power plants are doing something similar to that already, where they generate electricity throughout the evening, move that water back up, and it continues to be used down. They're looking at more and more locations to do that. It's got some practical uses, but various other things as we'll be talking about here. Supply water to generate electricity. I touched on that a little bit. Look, got a little ahead of myself there. But on the other hand, several of these power plants, the dams that are generating electricity, are having difficulties right now. There's not enough water, let alone trying to pump it back up and use it again. There's not enough water for the people downstream to actually get the water they need to grow crops and to survive. So the need to generate electricity is going to be caused in several locations. So wherever they might consider putting in these particular regeneration plants using water as a battery, is got to look at it long term, because you never know for sure where droughts are going to occur in comparison to where there's going to be an excess of water.
Again, could I add a comment here, Tony?
Sure.
I think I mentioned not too long ago that Weinberg from Oak Ridge offered Los Angeles to build a nuclear plant that would be used for electrolysis of water and provide water for the growing crops in the valleys of California. He was turned down, but that was 50 years ago or 40 years ago. Maybe they would reconsider, and because there's a tremendous amount of water used in agriculture, and if one could cut that back, as you just say, you might save the Colorado River.
Yep. Now, Colorado River is not the only river that's having problems. China is also having a crisis, with their three
rivers.
Yes.
Three gorges.
Yep.
Okay.
It's also low at this point in time. Now, that's as of that writing of that article, that could have changed already at this point in time. But the impact as far as the glaciers, how that water gets there, whether it's monsoons getting there, I don't know enough detail on that particular slide associated with it.
Do you have a date? Do you have a date for that slide?
Let's see,
Roughly.
just a second. I think it's relatively recent.
Okay. Yeah, I think so too. I've heard about it, but just interested to know if.
Yeah, it was in August.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And in comparison, renewable energy, depending on water, will it survive the drought? They've got to look hard and long to determine where they're going to be using what battery, water batteries, I'd say.
Yeah.
Just a quick comment on China's. That's a 22 gigawatt facility. It's huge.
Yes.
And if they can't run that thing, they're going to be hurting from
No
a
doubt
lot
about
of power.
it. Yep.
Yeah, it's a monster dam.
Yeah.
By the way, here in Wisconsin, I was talking to people who work at the hydro plant in Sauk City. They said that we haven't been short of water much in Madison, but the northern part of Wisconsin is in a moderate drought, and the dam is normally putting out 32 megawatts, and it's down to 25%. It's only making 8 megawatts at the present time. So it just shows that these effects are even hitting Wisconsin.
Yeah.
This is Doug. I'm sure that the power output of most, if not all, hydroelectric dams is seasonal.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't draw too many conclusions, in particular with respect to Wisconsin, about anything going on at Sauk City.
Oh, no, I would quite agree that it's seasonal, Doug. I just meant that it by that very fact, we can't count on it being 32 all the time. It's these things are seasonal. Yeah.
Green hydrogen, touched on it a little bit earlier. They expect that the potential, at least, that ships, planes, various methods of using hydrogen to power large moving items is something that probably will be needed in the future, and they're still having a challenge to do that cost effectively. This is an approach towards, and one of the reasons I'm touching on battery technology, the strong emphasis towards green energy being focused on solar panels and wind turbines needs a backup somewhere in the area of at least 20% of the electricity that would be driven. If all we had was solar and wind, we'd have to get at least a 20% backup of electricity from sources like water or whatever types of batteries might be developed. This particular one, just recently read the article associated with super hot salt becoming a battery at some point in time in the future. Whether that's cost effective, that's still presenting plenty of challenges. The company almost went bankrupt a while back, but they've gotten revitalized and they're moving forward. So kind of giving you a background in relationship to my perception of why we need more energy. The one thing I didn't touch on strongly, and that is consumerism. In people around the world requiring more and more electricity because they buy more and more things. They have air conditioning that they'll be needing more of in the future. Hopefully heat pumps will do a better job long-term as far as generating that electricity, whether a heat pump is ground source or air source. But in any case, there's key elements. Clean energy here in Wisconsin, as we heard from Marie Redmond, director of the Wisconsin's Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy, nuclear power is included in it. Their only emphasis was keeping the one plant that we have currently continuing to operate through at least 2050. That's good news. On the other hand, there isn't a strong emphasis within the report to develop additional plants within Wisconsin, which I think it's a good candidate for looking at it. And I'm glad the utility that we've talked to over on the west side is definitely looking at that approach. The climate change report that came out from the IPCC earlier this year. This report was published and Greg Nemitz, the professor that we had speak to us a week ago, excuse me. He was a lead writer. His area of primary focus is solar power. That's why he talked primarily about solar power. He's written a couple books associated with that. He's also his background is in analyzing the overall impacts as far as where costs and benefits come from. That's where his background comes from. If you go through that report, he's the lead writer associated with primarily solar and justifying solar and ramping up solar. But throughout this report, 246 times, it mentions nuclear power as a critical key element towards clean power in the future that we have and that we need to develop as far as future. But it has its own challenges. If you read through the report, it's only a little over 2,000 pages. You come through a couple of different areas that talks about nuclear energy. Again, I won't necessarily read through all of this, but one of the key ones that I had not heard of previously, and that that's the second bullet point down here, talking about the estimated amount of uranium resources that are increasingly steady over the years, because China and other countries are ramping up, and Russia are ramping up more and more nuclear plants, and they're using more and more uranium. As it turns out, estimates are that we might have enough uranium for 130 years. And at one point in time, it was estimated 100 years. Those estimates, just like oil was supposed to have its demise. We had peak oil many years ago. The likelihood they might find more uranium somewhere is possible. Just like fracking, some other technology might come along. Oh, maybe we have it. It's thorium. So they definitely do talk that the future may be thorium. That's the yellow highlighted area, or spent fuels rods. Those rods that have only been used 2 or 3 or 4% of the energy that's in them. If we were able to come up with better nuclear power plants, possibly molten salt, that would actually use those spent fuels, we'd have a lot more nuclear energy for the future, and we wouldn't have to worry about it.
Tony, I would argue that nuclear has a bunch of problems, but probably the lowest ranking problem of them all is availability of fuel.
In actual fact, the interest in these alternatives has waned with better understanding of uranium deposits. So I think they've got a solution for the next 100 years, so don't worry about it. Unfortunately, the other elements that are identified within this report talks about the acceptance of nuclear power, how it's a challenge to get it approved, it's a challenge to bring it in on cost effectively. Way too many challenges to do it, unfortunately, so it doesn't get as much of an emphasis as it should. This is a report that comes out from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. It's based on a report that's that I'll touch on here shortly. That's a separate report from another company that's been tracking it over the years. In any case, it attempts to levelize costs, and that levelized costs it attempts to look at where are their subsidies, how are their subsidies planned to drop off, where are there improvements that are potentially coming, which approach is the best to take. And the challenge is it varies depending on where you're at within the country. Of course, when you start talking about wind and or solar, they're better in certain locations than others. It's not that you can't make them somewhat cost effective, but they're more cost effective, in other areas. Hydroelectricity and so on. They attempt to quantify and qualify which is the best approach towards being used. This is a generalization as far as the U.S. is concerned.
Tony, could you elaborate on solar hybrid? Do you know what that means?
I do not remember, and I'm not even sure I came across that particular definition.
They've got a footnote CD. They have a footnote CD which might explain it, but
yeah,
I don't see it there.
It is a lengthy report, and I just took a snapshot of it. I'd have a little bit of a challenge. This chart is represented multiple different times, so I wouldn't be able to get to it right now.
I was wondering if it might be compared to standalone. It's 50% more expensive almost, or not quite, maybe 10%. They might mean by hybrid ability to tilt the solar panels to face the sun more.
It could.
It might also be bifacial panels that have, ability to produce electricity on both sides of the panel. So they're sticking straight up vertical,
Okay, thank you, Lee. Good idea.
Oh, I've got a slide. Let me take a second, just a second. So this is a couple of slides associated with nuclear reactors. This from the World Nuclear Organization, molten salt reactors was updated last year. Yes, they've been operating. Yes, there are challenges and getting them developed appropriately to be scaled. I still look at it as far as using those spent fuels long term, and what we're leaving for the future should be used in some way, and we should be developing something to use them.
Here.
China just went live in August. It was agreed that they could bring their particular molten salt reactor up. So it was cleared for startup. This was back in August. I believe it's running at this point in time. It's actually generating electricity on their grid.
That's actually 2 units.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Okay. I also read an article just recently that I don't believe I have the slide captured on it, that they have a thorium-based reactor that has been approved in development. So nuclear power titans, there's no doubt about it. It's a combination of China and Russia that have overtaken the U.S. in relationship to developing that technology. That's where it stands at this point in time. I don't think that's where it's going to continue to stay based on a couple other things that I'll be sharing with you here shortly.
And it should be noted that the Chinese technology has come from the U.S. and the French reactor designs.
Yes. Yeah, they've got several different designs they picked up from other countries, and they are further developing those within their country, of course. And if you look at solar panels, of course, we developed them first here in the US and in our space program, and then started putting them on the White House. Unfortunately, we left it live for too many years before we started developing it again.
Can I make a comment real quick?
Oh, sure.
The hybrid solar apparently refers to linking your solar panels into the grid.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Doug.
So Richard and I both happen to come across this particular audio that I'll be running here shortly that you won't be able to hear, but the link will be available if you hear at a later point in time. Dr. Catherine Huff, Assistant Secretary of Nuclear Energy, just happens to be a PhD graduate from the University of Madison. She did an excellent job on NPR a short time ago in presenting an excellent overview of why nuclear is necessary and practical and what we should be doing with it. It's a 7-minute one. I won't go through it, but one of the things she strongly suggests is all those coal plants that we still have in the US ought to be changed over to nuclear plants, similar to what's being done on the west side of Wisconsin, hopefully in the future. Yep. And a very strong advocate. I think when you do listen to this at a later point in time, and you don't actually have to just listen to it, you can look at the everything that NPR does. They have the transcript also. I'm no intent to read through the whole 7-minute transcript at this point in time. I'll lose my voice. But in any case, an excellent representative of what's happening in that industry. And like I said, she's an assistant director.
Assistant Secretary of Energy.
Yep.
Yep. Good.
Okay, so not necessarily totally wrapping this up, but more than willing to discuss it more. In my opinion, yes, we do need more nuclear energy. We need to develop it, all the clean energy sources, reviewing and ever-changing modeling development costs of energy sources and energy storage. I apologize, I had trouble with that particular slide in a couple of the audios, but like I say, when I send out the information, you'll have the opportunity to listen and hear them. The ad from Hitachi, I think, is excellent, does a real nice job of positioning. It's marketing, so you expect that to happen to some extent. But the other articles, I think, put it into proper perspective. So with that, I kind of turn it over to any further discussions or,
Tony, I'd love to jump in it for a second, if I may. You talked a couple of times in your slides about the need for baseload, 20%, and I think implied that nuclear might do that very well, especially since hydro seems to be seasonally affected and somewhat climate affected. My question is, would you be so daring as to suggest a number that it could go to? Would you like to aim for 80%? Would you think that would be too high? France has done it. Do you think that's excessive or somewhere in between? What are your thoughts there?
I don't have enough knowledge to give you a good assessment. My opinion is it should be more than what we have now. And I try to say I'd like to look at things holistically, as far as considering all the factors associated with both in the short term, how much you invest now in comparison to what you're going to get out of it in the future, in comparison to what you're going to do with it in the long term. Years ago, I talked about a approach towards waste management. That anything that we build, we should be able to transition it and put it back into use in some other way. They don't have a good source yet for recycling solar panels or batteries, but they expect to have it in the future. each of those things need to be truly understood in a world that's needed to last for, hopefully millions of years into the future. We've only been on this earth for, humanoids for what, a couple 100,000 years. The universe has been around for a lot longer for that, and the Earth, of course, has been around. It's going to be around for a long time in the future. We should be looking at the broader picture and broader perspective on it. So, I don't have an exact number. Don't know.
Sure, I was challenging you a bit there, Tony, because I know you're very cautious, and I respect that. I would like to answer a little bit to your comment about waste and remind people that nuclear energy is the only source of energy that I know of in the world that has already built up funds before plants were developed, funds for recycling. I don't know of any other source where they have done that, certainly not in the solar and wind industry that I'm aware of. And that money is in reserve. In some cases, it has been spent at a place like Yucca Mountain, only to be turned into a political joke. And after a huge amount of money was spent on that facility. And so, but at least there was effort made at the very beginning to deal with the waste problem by the nuclear industry.
I agree with you. Definitely that, and the funding and the consideration of that's something that we have to keep in mind, and it's better to have a potential resource that we'll be using 5-10 years from now if we properly develop the molten salt reactors and or continue to use it in the medical industry.
I have a good question here from Lee Gasper Galvin to everyone, but specifically I think to us. She says, which environmental organizations are anti-nuclear? And then she says, so I will know not to send them dollars anymore. Take it away, Tony.
Well, the only one I know clearly is Union of Concerned Scientists. That's a definite one that they're adamantly against it, and they continue to be adamantly against it. But there are others out there. One I know is associated with healthcare. I don't remember its name off the top.
Well, Greenpeace says right on their website that they're adamantly opposed, and the Sierra Club also does, and there are a host of others. But to go back to the Union of Concerned Scientists, to their credit, I called them up one day and talked to a spokesperson over the phone, and they said that they have this specialist, Dr. Layman, L-Y-M-A-N, and that's what a little confused me when you started your talk with Layman. I wanted to make sure it wasn't Lyman, but he is very concerned about safety regarding nuclear energy. But the Union of Concerned Scientists has publicly changed their tone and said that they now support nuclear, but within the cautions that Edwin Lyman raised. And I saw Edwin Lyman on television not too long ago responding to some questions, I think it was on the NewsHour, about the nuclear plants and the dangers that in Ukraine. And I thought he handled the questions extraordinarily well. He was concerned about their safety. So the only time I've actually heard him talk, I thought he was very good, but I think he does emphasize safety sometimes to the extreme, and that sometimes gets in the way of public discussion about nuclear energy.
Now,
This is Steve Shellen.
Yeah.
Referencing that set of comments, referring to the Ukraine power plants.
Yep.
Those are atypical relative to the bulk of the power plants around the world.
Good point.
It's restricted to the Ukrainian Chernobyl design and others in what used to be the USSR.
Yes, they're graphite moderated, but any plant, when you shut down the power to them, will have a problem, as we saw in Fukushima. So even though it's a relatively unsafe design compared to the light water reactors that are prevalent in most of the world, the point remains when you start shelling them. And I saw some holes where the rockets had gone through into underground compartments that were remarkably close to the reactors. That's I think will scare anybody.
The IPCC report, which was generated, and I don't know if they've actually came up with a final analysis on that report, but in any case, they said nuclear is not necessary for every country.
Not in a war zone, that's for sure.
That's for sure.
And that plant, by the way, is the biggest one in Europe. So, and it's a tragedy what Putin is doing to that, using it as a vehicle for threatening about dirty bombs and whatnot. It's just a tragedy. There needs to be the only people who stand up to Putin, it seems to me, is the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they've been at least doing their best. I wish somebody could do more.
And I would again comment that relative to safety, when you have a war, it doesn't matter whether it's nuclear or chemical explosives. That's a completely different set of safety conditions. It's completely unsafe.
Yeah.
It's I think you're right, except that the long-term consequences are different. And I think that's really, it's actually worth discussing. It is a consideration that certainly, we've never, as a group, considered, because we never, I would say, speaking for myself, I would have never thought that I would have to consider the possibility of someone using a power plant as a weapon.
Yeah, it is a problem, because if you're just talking about a radioactive leak, that's one thing that can be managed, because it's very, very low concentrations, and that can be diluted or controlled. But where you're having a weapon like a rocket arriving on a plant, that is very, very scary, and it I don't know of a safe way of managing or justifying that. I think they just nuclear plants ought to be declared off limits. It should be an article of war, just like other laws that we have.
That could be, Richard, but people violate the articles or the rules of war all the time. It's war, after all.
Yeah, that's true.
The people who win, they're the ones who get to declare what the rules are.
Right. The other thing, can I just mention one other thing, sort of going along with Doug? You hit a reactor like that and you get a big plume. That plume travels, and I have next door neighbors who lived in Poland growing up, and they had to take some kind of chemical to counteract these plumes from Chernobyl, and they travel big distances. They're not just over the immediate area. I don't know all that much about it, but that's another issue to think about.
Right. Iodine pills are issued for the uptake into the thyroid.
Right. That's what it was.
Yes.
Can I make one, while we got a little lull, I want to make one plug for Wednesday evening. And we hadn't heard much about energy storage. I know Tony talked about batteries. I like the term storage better than batteries, but whatever. There is a presentation by Argonne, who has this Out Loud program. And if you've registered, don't forget to tune in. I think it will be taped. It will be, there may be an option to see it later, but if you could see it live, that would be, I think, worth your time. And I don't know what they're coming up with. I have no inside track on what they're, all going to cover with that. But I know there's recycling of batteries and things like that that have been mentioned. Yeah, so just a plug.
Thank you very much. That's Lou talking?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'm registered, and I plan to take some slides through the talk, and could summarize it. If not beforehand. I've got a talk coming up next spring entitled Looking for looking for optimism. And so I'm hoping to find some positive things, and I'll include that in my talk in the fall. The first one, since we're on the subject, is I don't have it logged in, but anyway, it's the third Monday in September. So I think it's the 23rd or something like that. I'll let you know about it beforehand. Anyway, thank you for that, Lou. And
Oh, sure.
Good idea.
It's coming up. It's just 2 days from now in the evening.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah.
Lou,
Thanks.
this is Tony. I'm signed up for it also. The terminology I use as far as battery water storage, right? That wasn't me. That was the highlighted articles that I picked off of. And I think that's the press just trying to relate something that might be of, let's say, a correlation for people to understand.
Right.
it.
It's in the vernacular. I
Yep.
mean, it's in that people understand
Yep.
batteries right off the bat. And
Yep.
the distinction isn't that big of a deal, really. Thanks.
Yep. Any other thoughts or discussion that we'd like to have?
I could ask you a question, Tony. Your title of your talk, I think, is A Layman's Perspective. And I was wondering if you could address how your thinking evolved as a layman from the time you first started hearing about nuclear energy, and as you got into it. Some people get turned off, some people get turned on, some people just sort of, well, we'll think about it later. Could you elaborate for us the evolution in your thinking?
Sure. Let's see. I guess. Oh, gee, two different things. One of which I remember doing a workshop at a company that I was with. Actually, it was Sunbeam Corporation, and we went up to the nuclear power plant that's on Lake Michigan at
Point Beach.
oh, gee,
Yeah.
what's that?
Either Point Beach or Kewanee at that time.
Yeah, it was. I believe it was Point Beach, and the hotel that we stayed at. We actually had the hotel to ourselves. There were around 50 of us that went through that particular presentation, and I'd say that was my first exposure of being close to one. Then, of course, the movie came out with Jack Lemmon and Jane Fonda.
Right.
That got me additional exposure to what might be possible with 3 Mile Island or whatever, unfortunately. But then as I researched more associated with it later on, with the utility industry group that I was with, they were definitely supportive of it and thought it should be turned around. But during the time period that I was involved with that group, they never turned it around at that point in time. And their main focus was primarily on internal infrastructure and selling into utilities and utilities buying equipment and stuff like that. And there wasn't a strong emphasis on nuclear power at that point. I'd say the last part of it, Richard, that I'll touch on is a good part of it is from yourself and everything that we've talked about in these sessions.
Okay, what were your thoughts? I'd like to know what your thoughts were, particularly when you saw the Point Beach plant. What went through your mind that was positive, was negative? What thoughts were circulating in your cerebrum?
Oh, about the only thing I could say is, oh, gee, that's generating a lot of electricity for lots of people. And it appears to be operating with minimal or no impact on the environment around it. I think that's what was my perception of it.
Uh-huh. Huh? And since then, have you grown, if you had more stronger opinions, and how did you get those stronger opinions?
Two things. One is that we need to maintain and continue to keep the plants that we have as long as they are productive, effective, and don't have problems. Or if they have problems, fixing the problems at a reasonable cost before they're shut down. Mm-hmm. And the last thing is I'm definitely much more enamored with the concept of using up those spent fuels with the 4th generation technology.
Yes. Yeah. I remember when James Hansen came to Milwaukee about 7 years ago and gave a talk, and the audience just gave a gasp of realization of the huge magnitude. It just changed so many thinking patterns about nuclear energy. It was a big mind blow for them. So I think that's a very good point. Um, and a lot of people do focus on waste. When you hear people like, who's that guy from Senator from Massachusetts, Bernie Sanders, and he's even influencing Elizabeth Warren in his negativity about waste, as he calls it, which really is just more fuel. And somebody needs to educate people like him. He's a vocal person representing the far left of the political spectrum, and unfortunately, the Democratic Party has been a long time opposed to nuclear energy, but they have recently embraced it in their platform. Are you aware of that, Tony? And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was definitely, as far as the support that was indicated by Dr. Huff on the NPR program, was that there's growing support for nuclear energy moving forward, not just within the energy sector as far as the government, the administration of it, but also at the White House and President Biden's staff.
Mm-hmm. I just happened to turn on Turner Classic Movies Saturday night at 7:00, which I sometimes do, and there was Al Gore giving an inconvenient truth that went on for an hour and a half, and I thought, well, now I'm watching Al. He's an interesting guy and had some magnificent slides on climate change, and I thought, well, I'm going to count the number of times he uses the word nuclear, and there were 2 times. The first time was in reference to the ride he got in a nuclear submarine where he came up through the North Pole, the ice there. And so the word nuclear simply came up in terms of the fact that it was a submarine that could go a long distance. And the second time he mentioned nuclear was with a big picture of an explosion and a nuclear bomb. He did not mention it any other times, although he did touch on wind and solar a little bit. He mostly focused on the problem of climate change. It's unfortunate that Al has not endorsed nuclear energy in the past, and I think that's been one of those things that has slowed down the Democratic Party. I'm glad to see it becoming, there's no need for it to become politicized, and I'm glad to see that's a positive evolution from the point of view of the Democratic Party.
Al Gore was anti-nuclear prior to writing his book.
Yes, because I have his book and others, and I've noticed that he just he doesn't use irrational thinking, but he just feels that it's too expensive and too slow to build, and therefore forget it. And I've seen that in quite a number of other sites too. The quick disappointment with the length of time to build and the cost. Forgetting, of course, that when Eisenhower asked Rickover to build the first nuclear reactor at Shippingport, Pennsylvania, it took 2.5 years and was under budget. So it can be done.
Can I say one thing? You didn't have the NRC back then, did you, Richard? No NRC. Thanks, Jimmy Carter.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you, Lou. I was hesitant to step in and note that one of the barriers is the techno infrastructure built up in the NRC that really delays any progress on a fast track scale.
Can you elaborate a little bit, Stephen?
Well, perhaps the most recent one is the plant life extension, which increases the license of an operating nuclear plant an additional 20 years if it has reached 15 years in that period or later. The first round of plant life extension has gone through the industry, and pretty much every operating plant now has a license to go from the initial 40 years to 60 years. The applications for 60 to 80 years have been led by Turkey Point. Point Beach has its application in. Turkey Point got approval, and then the White House sent a letter to the NRC that said, you know, the citizens committees that come into play in the review of the application may not represent, may have members that do not represent the gender, nationality, other aspects of the communities where the plant is located. Therefore, you should re-review these. And so the NRC, which had approved the environmental review for Turkey Point, which was kind of a slam dunk because nothing had changed from the 40 to 60 year application to the 60 to 80 year application. So that had already been approved. They unapproved it, and it's been in limbo since then, which has been now, I think, about 2 years.
Wow.
And it's hard to overcome those sorts of political jabs into the system that get reacted to, rather than saying that's scientific hogwash. We're not going to do it.
Who was president at the time of that, in the White House at the time of that rejection?
It's come since it's come from the Biden administration.
Oh, that's too bad. He needs to talk to Dr. Huff.
I had the opportunity to talk to her during a review or a walkthrough of the nuclear reactor at UW-Madison about a year ago. And, their hands are bound when it comes to the political input from the White House, and that's it.
That's too bad. Well, thanks for that tip, Stephen. And I think you make a point, a very valid point, that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a big stumbling block. They charge, I've forgotten, millions and millions of dollars to review an application, enough to put some small businesses just out of business. And then they take a remarkably long time, months to years, to review them. So that system badly needs to be revamped and streamlined. Any further comments, Stephen, on that?
And I can't criticize the people there. It's the legislative infrastructure that has been built up that allows this input from outside to override the scientific facts.
Yeah, that's a shame.
One thing I will say in regards to Dr. Huff, in her comments as far as on NPR, she says that the Biden administration is supportive of moving forward. In addition, the bill that was passed a few months ago, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, has I know it's over 300 million for clean energy, including nuclear support as far as funding is concerned. So there's definitely funding associated with it. I don't doubt that the bureaucracy behind it is something else. I'm not sure if I've mentioned it before. I happen to be involved with the Census Bureau when we took the 2020 census during COVID, and the bureaucracy associated trying to take it during a environment. It was, mind altering almost as far as myself, and it was almost a terrible experience on one hand, but complicated because of what was happening, and that's government direction, everything, having to be down in writing in such a way that you can't vary from it, unfortunately.
The Biden administration may say it's pro-nuclear, but it has not shown that in actual fact.
Yeah.
And the legislation, you have to read the legislation to really see what the impact is on the process, and the process is what delays the time frame. When you have, it goes out for comments, and the comments may be a 90-day period. And then the review has an unlimited period until all of the issues that are brought up are resolved to the satisfaction of the committee. And then it goes through the approval process up through the ACRS to the commissioners. And if they have a question, then it may go back to the bottom of the process and go out for recomment on an issue. And then you have the same time frame built in automatically. And it can be layered through 1, 2, or 3 or more cycles on an issue, and that just delays the process.
Yeah.
And if you started gathering your finances for the project at the beginning, by the time that delay is in there, the people who are committing money may have gone through an inflation, an interest rate hike, and dollars disappear.
Yeah, that's a shame. Well, let's be more optimistic for a closure on this. Any other upbeat thoughts here about a layman's perspective or takeaway on nuclear energy? Any other thoughts from the group out there?
I have a thought, or have a perspective.
Murray?
So,
yeah.
So yes. So at one of my current events classes, the topic of nuclear came up, and the single most confusing aspect of the word nuclear has to do with students all the way through college tend not to get any exposure to atomic physics. So the letters and the numbers and what's uranium and atoms, there's a basic science understanding that makes it all seem like a little bit of a mystery, if not witchcraft. So and I was surprised because my current events group, there's a lot of pretty educated people. They said, well, I said, well, surely you had some class in atomic physics. In what? You mean physics? Yeah, I got physics. You're talking forces and about, no, I'm talking about atoms. And so atomic physics is an area of education that surprisingly, even among pretty educated Madisonian kind of PLATO people, it's like, so I did a whole current events class on atomic physics, and it was, I mean, deer in the headlights. So I think, we sit around talking like nuclear, yeah, and we throw around atoms and, spent fuel and words like that. It's like fuel. So how does fossil fuel get to be spent? Right. And when uranium is, nuclear fossil fuel is a tangible thing that doesn't look like coal or ashes. It's completely different. And so I think there's an atomic physics education that is a real stumbling block. Kind of like even what Tony said when he's standing there at the nuclear power plant at Point. It's like, wow, there's a lot coming out of there. How's that happen?
Yeah.
Can I make a comment real quick on that?
Sure, Doug.
So it turns out I actually tutor up at the high school at West High School a couple of times a week. And I actually tutor in lots of different subjects. And the other day, I was helping out a girl in chemistry, and I was, I'll say, pleasantly surprised that she was learning about isotopes. And so, I don't necessarily disagree with you, Mert, that certainly as I was growing up, none of that was exposed to me. But I guess I can report that at the high school level now, people are being introduced, or kids are being introduced to this in chemistry courses.
That's really a positive for the future. I'm thinking my group obviously was retired folks. So you're really the PLATO people like us. So maybe the problem rests with the politicians who are so ignorant of the basic science of atomic physics that they just shovel it aside and say, nah, I don't understand enough, so let's do something I understand.
And actually at the political level, I will tell you from experience that I've had with Citizens Climate Lobby, going to Washington to lobby all manner of legislators, right and left and center, that generally speaking, those offices rely on people like you and me and us to educate them on lots of different subjects. They can't possibly know as much as they need to know about all the topics they touch on. So they actually rely on lobbyists and literally people like us to talk to them and become trusted sources of information. So, you know, if you have a feeling about a particular legislator, you know, you can always set up a meeting with them, and their office will meet with you.
A very good point, Doug.
Yeah, that is. When I think back into my Canadian education, it was we have a grade 13 in Ontario where we take advanced physics and chemistry, but we didn't really, other than the periodic table and basic chemistry, we didn't really learn that much about isotopes or anything like that. And it wasn't until I got into a PhD in medical biophysics that I started learning something about atomic physics. So I agree with you that it's not a subject that is brought down to the high school level. Generally, it's pretty specialized, and it reflects itself in people that you meet. I remember meeting Cousteau's son, Jean-Michel, and went on a trip with him to the Caribbean. And I started asking him about the plant in California. He's now living in Santa Barbara. And he said, he says, I don't think I want that plant to continue. And I said, well, what is your concern about Diablo Canyon? And he said, well, they tell me that as a result of Fukushima, that there's tritium in the ocean water off California. So if that's the case, then why would I want to renew Diablo Canyon? And I said, does anybody, where did you get this great fear of tritium? Oh, he says, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. He says, I'm an underwater guy. I don't know anything about science. And it made me realize that I had been carrying tritium thymidine. Tritiated thymidine is a precursor of DNA because of the thymidine, and it's used as a tracer in biological studies. I was looking at the thymus gland and taking bottles of tritiated thymidine to my mother's home on weekends from Toronto to London, and not thinking anything about it. It's a very weak beta emitter. And here was Jean-Michel concerned about minuscule amounts of tritium in the water, which you could drink. That'd be far less toxic than seawater, or no more toxic than seawater. And so the public simply has no concept of the dangers of tritium. It's not to say that it doesn't have some dangers in concentrated forms, but people have even thought that it might be a bit dangerous if you had a fusion reactor and a lot of tritium fuel escaped from the reactor. It might be a problem there. But other than that, tritiated water floating across the Pacific is just a silly myth that has scared all people because they have no knowledge of isotopes.
I think it's wonderful that Doug is infusing this information to somebody at the high school level, because I'm sure the high school teachers that teach physics are teaching Newtonian physics and probably have not been exposed to atomic physics at all.
Right. Thank you, Doug. You're a hero.
You know what I wanted to emphasize is that I tutor. I don't bring this stuff up in class or with a student because it's something of interest to me. I bring it. I discuss things that they are taking on in class, so they are actually learning this in class already. That's what my point was.
Yeah. Well, that's
but
good.
You had a question to explain something to them. They brought up the subject, but you had the information they couldn't get in class.
Well, no, they just didn't understand it yet. You know,
Isn't that what I said?
You run into that all the time in high school.
Yeah.
Working with anybody. I mean, you could talk to me and I would don't understand things, and you guys can explain it to me.
Yeah, can I back up a little bit? My question, and certainly relates to what Tony's talked. We have all this energy and we know things have to change, but the population doesn't get it. They look at the war in Iran, in Ukraine and all these shortages in the EU, and then hope that never hits us in the US, but you can't have it both ways. Something's going to have to change. And the population is just so far out of it sometimes. They don't see. And granted, I'm not saying it has to change at a super fast rate, but
you're governed by the weakest link.
Yeah, that is the problem. That is a big
That's
problem.
reality. That's reality. That's not just a problem.
I mean, you gotta go where your reality is. I mean,
let's get back to Tony. I'd like to ask you, Tony, what's your knowledge of isotopes, and do you find that you required that knowledge in order to accept nuclear energy?
Oh, first off, I don't have an understanding of isotopes. Did I get exposure in high school? I went to technical high school in Chicago, which I did get exposure to it to some extent, but very little, and I don't remember it at this point in time. And as I've, let's say, gone into research and understanding it, I understand that it generates heat when you go through a nuclear reaction, and that heat can generate power by various methods, and that's my understanding at this point in time. I did, while we were talking, look at the incentives as far as advanced nuclear deployment, and looking at the website associated with the U.S. government. It definitely says that the Inflation Reduction Act includes funding for the activities associated with new power design. So
yeah, it does. Yeah, that's good.
But it's really low funding.
Yeah, it's not enough. Yeah.
It's very small, very small.
Yeah.
Well, I think the one of the things that Tony, you might have come to appreciate somewhere along the way, if I can put words in your mouth or pry a little bit into your cerebrum, you must have come across at some point the energy density of nuclear energy. And some people argue about this professor from Oxford, Alice, who has a table showing that compared with oil or fossil fuels, that nuclear energy is about 1 million times more energy dense in terms of the megawatt hours per gram of tissue. It's a harder thing to compare with wind and solar. You don't have fuel, and so you have to think in terms of space required to generate so many gigawatts or something like that. But he makes a 10,000-fold down going when you go from coal or oil to wind and solar. So the net difference is about 10 logs. You could argue, some people might say 11, some people might say 9, and each one of those is a 10-fold difference. But the huge difference between wind and solar, it seems to me that we've been, when you look at the future of Wisconsin's energy, and you talk to Alliant Energy and Madison Gas and Electric, sure, they're thinking short term. They're thinking they need to put some solar panels in so they can clean up the quality of their electricity. But with that enthusiasm, there doesn't seem to be much knowledge of the 12 logarithms in difference. But you came across those insights, Tony, and I was wondering, how did you do that? Was that from joining PLATO or?
Yep, that's from Better Energies for a Cleaner, Cooler Planet that we started out with. That's when I found out about that. Okay. Did not know that before. I thought the the energy density was significant within uranium. Don't get me wrong, I had that understanding, but not that drastically different.
Yeah.
But in most people's minds, that's not a clear factor. You know, I mean, until the solar panels start stacking up somewhere in landfills, until the wind, turbines are not operating any longer, they aren't factors as far as but spent fuels are.
You remind me of a Lee's question. She wanted to know what organizations were anti-nuclear. There is an interesting organization that's quite active in Madison. It's called 350.org. And Bill McClymonds, I think, is the CEO of that organization. And you might not know, a lot of people don't know, where did he get the number 350? Well, he got it from James Hansen. And because James Hansen correctly said back in 1988 when he was addressing the US Senate that once it gets past 350, and at that time we were already, I think, about 370, and back in 1988. But he said that the planet would be much happier if it were at 350. And of course, now we're up to 417 or 420, somewhere up in there, in those healing curves that you showed us, Tony. And so somebody approached Bill McClymonds and said, you know where that number comes from. It comes from James Hansen, and he's pro-nuclear. How come you don't seem to be that way? And he said, if I went public with my feelings about nuclear energy, I would lose half my following. And that is very disappointing in his integrity if he feels that he can hoodwink people into thinking that they can do it all with wind and solar and will ultimately fail to address climate change properly without some help from nuclear. I think that's my thesis, is that nuclear is not only beneficial, but it's essential if we're going to dispense with fossil fuels. I don't think we can do it without nuclear energy. And for Bill McClymonds to come across is a big disappointment to me in his integrity.
Yeah. Each of the organizations that I've come across, because I did attend several of the 350.org meetings when I first moved to Madison 12 years ago. And I attended, of course, the CCL. I was much more enamored, and definitely still am, with CCL, even though I'm not as active as I was years ago. Doug, I know from my understanding, continues to be very active with CCL, which is great. I think it's a fantastic organization. And I do think that if we had their approach towards actually putting a cost on carbon, nuclear would come out a lot better as far as an energy source financially, because gas and coal would go up significantly over time. And it had put in 10, 12 years ago, it would be up significantly, and we probably wouldn't be driving any gas cars because everybody would want EVs like more people do when the gas prices go up.
Exactly. There's an interesting table made at a website called Thoughtscapism. And it's a woman in Scandinavia. I'm forgetting her name. She has a complicated, tricky last name, but you'll find a reference to it at rethinkingnuclear.org. If you go to some of the finer points and look for cost, you'll see a table which takes into account not only the capacity factor, but the durability of nuclear energy. And they quote some numbers from Korea and I'm forgetting the other country, but they quote some numbers from Korea anyway, and they come up with cost per unit of energy based upon durability as well as capacity factor, and it's not nearly so bad. And it comes from the Thoughtscapism website. So if you want to check that out sometime, that's there. Also, there's to counter the problem of anti-nuclear concerns, there's a gal called, I'm going to mention her name because I've got a TED talk that she gave up on the front page of the website, rethinkingnuclear.org. And it's by Isabel Bomeke, Boemeke, from Brazil. She is I guess, a cosmetologist, and gives advice on taking good care of your skin. But she describes herself as a nuclear influencer, and her TED Talk is really quite entertaining and quite educational. So I was pleased to put it up on the website, because we just need sometimes people to maybe skip some of the science about isotopes, although she calls herself an isodope, making fun. She uses a lot of humor in her presentation. So I recommend both Thoughtscapism and Isabel Bomeke for some positive aspects of nuclear energy. If there are no other thoughts, it's 11:45. We can probably wrap up. Is that okay with you, Tony?
It definitely is, yeah. I've completed everything I expect to. It's unfortunate that the audio portion didn't come across, and I would have played more of that, and I think you would have got a better perspective of some
We
of the
look
things that come
forward
across.
to the recording. Thank heavens for Plato's recordings, and we can do that. I look forward to that very much, Tony. And I will be sending out to you, all of you, an agenda for this spring. I have 3 empty slots still. Tony has offered to do one on home gardening, I believe. Douglas Tellamy, one of my heroes. I'm really looking forward to that next spring, and I've got 2 or 3 talks planned, and Doug is going to possibly work on one, and other people are chipping in, so I appreciate it. Lee has got a field trip lined up for us with a company that does transportation, electric transportation in Madison. I appreciate that, Lee. So we're all thinking ahead. We've got 3 months to, best part of 3 months before they pick up again. So continue to write in, and I will send you out a tentative sheet, and we can fill out that sheet. So it's been great these last 10 weeks. We've had 11 weeks actually this fall term. So look forward to next spring, and wish you all very happy holidays, and we'll stay in touch.
Merry Christmas to all.
Merry Christmas indeed. Thanks,
Happy
Richard. Thanks,
holidays.
Tony.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
very
And thank
much.
you all
You
also
guys.
for comments.
Pleasure is ours. Bye-bye now. It's really nice
Bye.
having you guys here.
All right.
Bye.